Hello, and welcome to History for Sleep. Tonight, let the noise of the modern world fade away as we journey back 2,000 years. Settle in, get comfortable, and let the epic story of Rome's greatest conqueror, Julius Caesar, guide you toward rest. The air inside the Curia of Pompey on the 15th of March, 44 BC, was heavy with anticipation. The senators of Rome, men dressed in the traditional white toga with a purple stripe indicating their rank, took their seats. They were the masters of a world that stretched from the sun-scorched sands of Syria to the gray, cold shores of the Atlantic. Yet, on this day, many of them felt like subjects, waiting for the arrival of one man who had become more powerful than all of them combined. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar. When he entered, the senators rose in a show of respect. At 55 years old, Caesar was no longer the tireless campaigner who had conquered Gaul. His face was lined, and his body was beginning to show the strain of a life lived at a pace few could endure. He suffered from what might have been epilepsy, experiencing seizures that were kept secret from the public. But his presence still commanded the room. He moved with an assurance that bordered on arrogance, taking his seat on a gilded chair, a special honor granted to him by a senate that both feared and admired him. The business of the day was about to begin. A group of senators approached him, seemingly to present a petition. One of them, Tillius Cimber, knelt before Caesar, pleading for the return of his exiled brother. As he spoke, he grabbed Caesar's toga, pulling it down from his shoulders. This was not a plea. It was a signal. From behind, another senator named Servilius Casca lunged forward. He held a dagger, small and easily concealed. He aimed for Caesar's neck, but in his nervousness, the blow was clumsy, leaving only a shallow gash. Caesar, shocked, sprang into action. He was a veteran of countless battles, a man whose instincts were honed by decades of life-or-death situations. He spun around, shouting in Latin, "Vile Casca, what is this you do?" He stabbed Casca's arm with his stylus, a sharp tool used for writing on wax tablets. For a brief, desperate moment, it seemed he might fight them off. But then the others swarmed him. This was not a duel. It was a frenzied execution. Over 60 men were part of the conspiracy, and now they all seemed to move at once, a chaotic mob of white togas and flashing blades. They were so frantic to strike a blow that they injured one another in the process. Daggers meant for Caesar found the arms and hands of fellow senators. He tried to defend himself, twisting and turning, but he was surrounded, trapped. He was being stabbed from every direction. He fought until he saw a face in the crowd of his assassins. It was a face he knew well, a face he had shown great kindness to. It was Marcus Junius Brutus. Brutus was the son of Caesar's favorite mistress, Servilia, and a man Caesar had pardoned after the Civil War, promoting him to high office. He had treated Brutus almost like a son. Now Brutus stood before him, his own dagger bloody. Seeing him, Caesar stopped fighting. All resistance left his body. He pulled the top of his toga over his head, covering his face as if to shield himself from the sight of this final betrayal. He accepted his fate. According to the historian Suetonius, his last whispered words were in Greek, "Kai su, teknon?" You too, my child. Gaius Julius Caesar fell at the base of a large statue of his greatest rival, Pompey the Great, his body pierced by 23 separate wounds. Silence descended upon the room. The assassins, their hands and clothes stained with the blood of the most powerful man in the world, raised their daggers and proclaimed that liberty had been restored to Rome. But the other senators, frozen in terror, had already fled. The liberators walked out into the city, expecting to be hailed as heroes. Instead, they found empty streets as the people of Rome locked their doors, sensing that this was not an end to tyranny, but the beginning of chaos. The blood that soaked the floor of the Senate House in 44 BC was the result of a sickness that had been festering in the Roman Republic for over a century. From the outside, Rome was a marvel. A small city-state that had, through relentless warfare and sheer determination, conquered Italy, defeated its great rival Carthage, and spread its influence across the entire Mediterranean. Its legions were invincible, its engineering was legendary, and its wealth seemed limitless. But this rapid expansion, this very success, had poisoned the heart of the Republic. The foundation of Rome's early strength was the citizen farmer. A man would own a small plot of land, work it with his family, and when the state called, he would pick up his sword and shield to serve in the army. He fought not for pay, but for his home, his land, and the glory of Rome. After a campaign, he would return to his farm. This system created soldiers who were disciplined, loyal, and deeply invested in the survival of the state. But by the 2nd century BC, this system was collapsing. The wars were no longer short, local campaigns. They were long, brutal conflicts fought in distant lands like Spain, Greece, and North Africa. A farmer could be called away to serve for years at a time. While he was gone, his family could not manage the farm alone. They fell into debt, often to wealthy aristocratic neighbors. These aristocrats, who grew rich from the spoils of war, were happy to buy up these small farms at low prices, consolidating them into massive estates called latifundia, which were worked by thousands of slaves captured in those same wars. So, a soldier would return home after years of service, having risked his life for Rome, only to find his family landless and his home gone. He and his family would have no choice but to drift to the city of Rome itself. The city's population swelled with a new class of people, a landless, jobless, and increasingly angry urban poor. They depended on handouts and the political patronage of the powerful to survive. The backbone of the Republic had been broken. This deep social crisis gave birth to a new, toxic form of politics. The Roman aristocracy, the men who sat in the Senate, split into two rival factions. These were not political parties with official members, but rather two opposing approaches to gaining power. On one side were the Optimates, a name that translates to the best men. These were the conservatives, the traditionalists. They were powerful, established families who believed that authority should rest solely with the Senate. They saw the Senate as the guardian of Roman tradition and stability. To them, any attempt to appeal directly to the masses or bypass the Senate's authority was dangerous and revolutionary. They were not necessarily evil. They simply believed that only the educated and wealthy elite were fit to rule, and they fought fiercely to protect that status quo. On the other side were the populares, meaning those who favor the people. It's a misleading name. The populares were almost always aristocrats themselves, often just as wealthy and ambitious as the Optimates. But they used a different strategy to achieve power. Instead of relying on the support of their fellow senators, they went directly to the people. They would propose popular measures in the public assemblies, things like land redistribution for the poor, subsidized grain, or debt relief. Their motives were rarely pure charity. The support of the masses was a weapon, a tool to be used against their Optimate rivals in the Senate, a way to build a powerful personal following that could propel them to the top. The conflict between these two factions was not a polite debate. It was a struggle for the soul of Rome, and it quickly turned violent. In the 130s BC, two noble brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, acting as populares, tried to pass laws to redistribute public land back to the poor. They were not trying to destroy the system, but to reform it to save it. The Optimates in the Senate saw this as a direct attack on their wealth and power. They responded not with arguments, but with force. Tiberius Gracchus was clubbed to death by a mob of senators and their clients on the Capitoline Hill. A decade later, his brother Gaius, facing a similar fate, chose to have his slave kill him. Thousands of their followers were hunted down and executed without trial. A terrible precedent had been set. Political disputes in Rome could now be settled with murder. The Republic was beginning to consume its own children. The murders of the Gracchi brothers were a symptom of Rome's sickness, but the disease itself was about to mutate into something far more deadly. The Republic's institutions were designed for a city, not an empire, and they were buckling under the strain. The most critical institution, the Roman army, was facing a crisis of its own. With the citizen farmer class decimated, Rome was struggling to find enough eligible soldiers to defend its vast and turbulent frontiers. A military disaster in North Africa and the terrifying threat of migrating Germanic tribes from the north exposed this weakness for all to see. The man who stepped forward to solve this problem was a formidable figure named Gaius Marius. Marius was not a typical Roman aristocrat. He was a new man, a homo novus, meaning he was the first in his family to be elected to the highest office of consul. He achieved this not through elegant speeches in the Senate, but through a reputation for being a brilliant, tough, and brutally effective military commander. He was a man the soldiers understood and respected. Facing a critical manpower shortage, Marius made a revolutionary decision that would save Rome in the short term and doom the Republic in the long term. He ignored the old property requirements and opened the ranks of the legions to any Roman citizen, specifically to the landless, unemployed masses crowding the city, the very men whose farms had been lost. For these men, the army was not a civic duty. It was a job, a career, and their only hope for a future. Marius promised them a salary, a share of the plunder from conquered enemies, and most importantly, a plot of land upon retirement. His reforms were a spectacular success. He created a professional, long-serving, and highly effective fighting force. These new legions saved Rome, annihilating the Germanic tribes in a series of bloody battles. The people of Rome hailed Marius as a hero, a third founder of the city, and elected him consul an unprecedented 7 times. But he had fundamentally and permanently changed the nature of the Roman army. The new legionaries fought for Marius, not for the Senate. Their loyalty was not to an abstract state that had left them destitute, but to the general who fed them, who led them to victory, and who was their only guarantee of a secure retirement. The Roman army was no longer the army of the Republic. It had fractured into a collection of private armies, loyal only to their charismatic commanders. A successful general now possessed the ultimate political tool: thousands of hardened veterans who would follow him anywhere, even against Rome itself. This new reality created the perfect storm when Marius's ambitions clashed with those of his brilliant, but ruthless aristocratic rival, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Sulla was an optimate, a champion of the Senate, and a gifted general in his own right. The rivalry between the two men, fueled by personal pride and political opposition, escalated until it tore the Republic apart. When the Senate granted Sulla a prestigious command in the East, Marius, using his popular support, had the decision overturned. Sulla's response was unthinkable. He did what no Roman general had ever dared to do before. He gathered his legions, men loyal to him personally, and marched on the city of Rome. The act was a profound sacrilege. For centuries, the sacred boundary of the city, the Pomerium, was a line no armed Roman soldier could cross. Sulla shattered this taboo forever. His soldiers stormed the city, fighting Roman citizens in the streets of the Forum. Marius was forced to flee, and Sulla asserted his control before leaving for his campaign. While Sulla was away, Marius returned with his own army, seized the city, and unleashed a bloody purge of Sulla's supporters. But Marius died shortly after, leaving his allies in a precarious position. When Sulla returned years later, victorious from his wars in the East, he was determined to exact a terrible revenge and restore the power of the Senate once and for all. He crushed the Marian forces in a final horrific battle at the gates of Rome and entered the city as its undisputed master. He had himself declared dictator, not for the traditional 6-month emergency term, but indefinitely. And then, he unleashed a new form of political terror known as the proscriptions. Sulla posted lists in the forum containing the names of his enemies. Anyone whose name appeared on these lists was stripped of their citizenship and declared an outlaw. They could be hunted down and killed by anyone, for a substantial cash reward. Their sons and grandsons were barred from holding public office, and most importantly, their entire fortunes, their lands, homes, and money, were confiscated by the state and auctioned off to Sulla's friends and supporters. It was a reign of terror that combined political cleansing with immense personal profit. Old scores were settled, personal debts were erased by accusing a creditor, and a generation of powerful men was wiped out. Fear, suspicion, and death hung over Rome. This was the world into which Julius Caesar came of age. Into this violent and unstable world, in the year 100 BC, a child was born. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar. He was born into the Julian clan, the gens Julia, a family that represented both the pinnacle of Roman society and its current political anxieties. The Julii were patricians, meaning they could trace their ancestry back to the original senators appointed by Romulus, the mythical founder of Rome. Their name carried immense prestige, a kind of inherited dignity that automatically set them apart from the majority of the population. But prestige alone did not equate to power in the late Republic. By the time of Caesar's birth, the Julii were not counted among the wealthiest or most politically dominant families. For several generations, they had failed to produce a consul, the highest office in the state. They were respected for their ancient name, but overshadowed by other clans who possessed vast fortunes and commanded greater influence within the Senate. What the Julii lacked in current political clout, however, they made up for with an extraordinary ancestral claim. They asserted that they were direct descendants of Iulus, the son of the Trojan prince Aeneas, who, according to legend, had escaped the burning ruins of Troy and settled in Italy, becoming an ancestor of the Roman people. And because Aeneas was the son of the goddess Venus, the Julii were, by extension, direct descendants of the goddess of love and beauty herself. For the Romans, this was not a mere genealogical curiosity. It was a powerful piece of political currency. It implied that the family was touched by the divine, destined for greatness, and enjoyed the favor of the gods. It was a claim Caesar would later use with brilliant political skill to build his own legend. His father, also named Gaius Julius Caesar, was a respectable politician who followed the traditional career path, the cursus honorum, serving as a magistrate in several positions. He was a man of some standing but never reached the absolute peak of Roman power. His career was solid, but not spectacular. The far more decisive influence in the young Caesar's life was his mother, Aurelia Cotta. Aurelia was a remarkable woman from a much more powerful and wealthy noble family. She was known throughout Rome for her intelligence, dignity, and strong character. In an age when the education of aristocratic children was often delegated to tutors and slaves, Aurelia took a direct and personal role in her son's upbringing. She ensured he received the finest education available in rhetoric, philosophy, and literature. Rhetoric, the art of public speaking, was the most essential skill for an aspiring Roman leader, and under his mother's watchful eye, Caesar would master it. The discipline, intelligence, and self-control that would later define him were likely instilled by Aurelia. She managed the family's modest finances with prudence and was regarded as the ideal Roman matron, or matrona, a woman of strength, virtue, and authority within the home. But the single most important factor that would define Caesar's youth was not his divine ancestry or his mother's guidance, but his family's dangerous political connections. His Aunt Julia, his father's sister, was married to the great Gaius Marius. This marriage placed the Julian family, and by extension the young Caesar, firmly in the political camp of the populace. He was the nephew of the most revered leader of the people's faction, a hero to the masses and a hated enemy to the conservative optimates in the Senate. He was born into one side of a blood feud. This connection would open some doors for him, granting him a degree of popular favor from the very beginning. But it also painted a target on his back. In the brutal world of Marius and Sulla, family alliances were not a matter of social standing. They were a matter of life and death. The child playing in the courtyards of Rome's Subura district had no idea that his uncle's fame would one day place his own life in mortal danger from the most powerful and ruthless man in Rome. As Caesar grew from a boy into a young man, he would have been keenly aware of the titanic struggle for power that was raging around him. His uncle Marius was a living legend, and the dinner table conversations in his home would have been filled with the politics of the populace faction. He was learning statecraft not just from tutors, but from living at the very center of one of its most powerful political dynasties. Then, when Caesar was just 16 years old, his life was abruptly altered. His father, while putting on his shoes one morning, collapsed and died without warning. In an instant, the teenage Caesar became the paterfamilias, the legal head of his household. This was a role of immense responsibility in Roman society. He was now in charge of the family's property, its finances, and the welfare and protection of his mother Aurelia and his sister Julia. He was forced to become a man overnight, learning to navigate the complex world of Roman law and finance at an age when most boys of his class were still focused on their studies. This new maturity, combined with his family's political influence, quickly propelled him forward. While Gaius Marius was now dead, his faction was still led by another powerful figure, Lucius Cornelius Cinna. Cinna, seeing promise in the intelligent and well-connected young Caesar, arranged two significant steps in his life. First, he secured for Caesar a nomination to become the new Flamen Dialis, the high priest of Jupiter. This was a position of great religious prestige but also a political cage. The priest was bound by a web of ancient and bizarre taboos. He could not ride a horse, touch metal, or even see a knot. It was a life of ritual, not of command, and it could have easily become a dead end for a man with military or political ambitions. Second, and far more importantly, Cinna arranged for Caesar to marry his own daughter Cornelia. This was more than a marriage. It was a political statement. By marrying the daughter of the leader of the populace, Caesar was publicly and permanently cementing his allegiance. He was now not just the nephew of Marius, but the son-in-law of Cinna. For a young man of 17, his path seemed set. He was connected to the ruling faction, betrothed to a powerful man's daughter, and destined for a life of prestige. But the world of the Roman Republic was built on shifting sands. Far to the east, the great rival of his new family, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, was concluding a series of brilliant military victories. For years, Sulla had been fighting Rome's enemies abroad, all the while hearing how his own enemies at home had seized his property, murdered his friends, and declared him an enemy of the state. Now, his wars were won, and he was coming back. He landed in Italy not as a returning hero, but as an invading conqueror, at the head of a battle-hardened army thirsty for revenge. The forces of Cinna and the populace faction tried to resist, but they were no match for Sulla's military genius and the discipline of his veterans. The civil war was short and brutal. Cinna was killed in a mutiny by his own troops. The armies of the populace were systematically crushed. Sulla marched on Rome for a second time, not with ultimatums, but with the sword. Caesar, still just a teenager, could only watch in horror as the entire political structure that had supported him was annihilated. The patrons who had arranged his future, the faction he had married into, the world he was preparing to enter, it all burned down in the fire of Sulla's return. Sulla entered the city not as a consul, but as a master. He had the Senate declare him dictator, giving him absolute power over the life of every Roman citizen. The bright future of Julius Caesar had vanished. He was now the nephew of Marius and the son-in-law of Cinna, in a city ruled by a man who had come to kill everyone associated with those two names. He was no longer a promising young aristocrat. He was a marked man, trapped in a city that was about to be washed in blood. Sulla's reign of terror was systematic. He was not just killing his enemies. He was re-engineering the Roman state, purging it of all Marian influence and concentrating power back into the hands of the Senate. As part of this, he demanded absolute loyalty. For the young aristocrats of Rome, this often meant proving their allegiance through a simple, yet deeply personal act: divorce. Marriages in Rome were political alliances, and Sulla wanted every one of those alliances to be with him. He ordered many young men to divorce wives who came from the families of his enemies. One of them was Julius Caesar. Caesar, now about 18 years old, received a direct order from the dictator: divorce your wife, Cornelia. To Sulla, this was a routine command. Cornelia was the daughter of Cinna, a hated enemy. Caesar was the nephew of Marius. The marriage was a symbol of the old regime, and it had to be dissolved. For any other young man, the choice would have been obvious and immediate. To defy Sulla was to defy a man who held the power of life and death in his hands, a man whose death squads roamed the streets. Disobedience meant having your name added to the proscription lists. It meant a death sentence. But Caesar did something that stunned the Roman elite. In an act of astonishing bravery, or what many saw as suicidal foolishness, he refused. He would not cast aside his wife. The reasons for his decision were likely complex. There is evidence to suggest that he genuinely loved Cornelia, but it was also a profound statement of personal honor and political identity. To obey would be to renounce his heritage, to bend the knee and accept the new order out of fear. By refusing, Caesar was declaring, in the face of the most dangerous man in the world, that he would not be broken. Sulla's fury was predictable and swift. He immediately stripped Caesar of his position as a priest. He confiscated Caesar's inheritance from his father. And most critically, he seized Cornelia's substantial dowry, leaving the young couple financially ruined. Then, Caesar's name was added to the lists. He was now an outlaw, a dead man walking. He had no choice but to flee Rome. He left the city in secret, becoming a fugitive. 4 months, he moved through the hills of central Italy, constantly changing his hiding place, never sleeping in the same spot for long, to avoid Sulla's bounty hunters. During this time, he contracted a dangerous fever, what was likely malaria, which would afflict him for the rest of his life. Weakened by illness and hunted, his situation seemed hopeless. Eventually, a sullen patrol captured him. This should have been the end. But even in this moment of extreme peril, Caesar's unique character shone through. Instead of begging for his life, he acted with a calm authority that seemed almost unnatural for his age. He bribed the patrol commander, a man named Cornelius Fagita, with 2 talents of silver, a huge sum he likely had to borrow, to let him go. The commander, perhaps impressed by the young man's audacity or simply motivated by greed, accepted the bribe and looked the other way. Meanwhile, back in Rome, Caesar's influential relatives from his mother's side, the Aurelii, along with other powerful friends, began to work on his behalf. They were not from the Marian faction and had some sway with Sulla's regime. They even enlisted the help of the Vestal Virgins, Rome's most sacred priestesses, whose appeals were almost never denied. They went before the dictator and pleaded for the young man's life, arguing that he was just a boy, too young to be a real threat. Sulla, after much resistance, finally and reluctantly agreed to grant Caesar a pardon. He removed his name from the proscription list. But as he did so, he gave a chilling and prophetic warning to the men who had interceded. According to the ancient biographers, he told them they were fools and that they would one day regret their pleas. "For in this boy," Sulla declared, "I see many Mariuses." In the defiant eyes of that teenager, the old dictator saw the same burning ambition, the same connection to the people, and the same iron will that he had seen in his greatest rival. He saw a seed of a future storm, and he knew that by sparing his life, he was allowing that seed to grow. Though his life had been spared, Caesar knew that Rome was no longer a safe place for him. Sulla was unpredictable, and his pardon could be revoked as easily as it had been granted. The wisest course of action was to put as much distance as possible between himself and the dictator. So he left Italy and sailed east, to the Roman province of Asia, which is modern-day Turkey. Here, he would begin his military service under the provincial governor. It was his first real taste of military life, and he quickly distinguished himself, earning the civic crown, one of Rome's highest military honors, for his bravery in saving the life of a fellow soldier during a siege. His military career was born not out of ambition, but out of the necessity to survive. After Sulla's death in 78 BC, the climate of fear in Rome began to lift, and Caesar decided it was time to return. However, he knew that his education in oratory, the most powerful weapon in Roman politics, was incomplete. He decided to travel to the island of Rhodes to study under the most celebrated teacher of rhetoric at the time, Apollonius Molon. It was on this journey that one of the most revealing and famous episodes of his life occurred. As his ship sailed across the Aegean Sea, it was intercepted by Cilician pirates. These were not common thieves. They were a powerful and organized naval menace that terrorized the trade routes of the Mediterranean. They captured Caesar and his small entourage, holding them for ransom. The pirates demanded a sum of 20 talents of silver, a considerable amount of money, equivalent to millions of dollars today. Their captives' reaction left them utterly bewildered. Instead of showing fear, Caesar laughed in their faces. He told them they clearly had no idea who they had captured. 20 talents, he declared, was an insultingly low price for a man of his stature. He insisted that he was worth, at the very least, 50 talents, more than double their initial demand. The pirates, amused by this arrogant young aristocrat, agreed. Caesar dispatched most of his servants to the nearest cities to collect the massive sum, a process that would take over a month. And so, for nearly 40 days, Caesar lived as a prisoner among the pirates. But he did not behave like one. From the very beginning, he acted as if he were their commander. When he wanted to sleep, he would order them to be quiet. He wrote poems and speeches and would read them aloud, complaining loudly if his captors did not show sufficient appreciation for his literary genius. He joined in their games and exercises, treating them not as guards, but as his subordinates. Throughout this entire time, he maintained a running joke with them. With a smile on his face, he repeatedly told them that once he was free, he would hunt them down, capture them all, and have every last one of them crucified. The pirates, charmed by this eccentric, fearless, and unbelievably arrogant young nobleman, found this hilarious. They thought he was joking. They were wrong. When the 50 talents finally arrived, Caesar was released. The first thing he did was not sail for Rhodes to resume his studies. He went straight to the nearest major port, Miletus. He did not wait for the Roman authorities to act. He did not file a report. On his own initiative, he raised a small naval squadron, recruited armed men, and immediately set sail for the pirates' hideout. He found them still celebrating their good fortune, completely unaware of the danger. He caught them by total surprise, capturing most of the men and recovering his 50 talents, along with all their other stolen treasure. He then dragged his prisoners before the Roman governor of the province, demanding that they be executed as the law required. But the governor was a weak and greedy man. He hesitated, seeing an opportunity to sell the healthy captives as slaves and pocket the money himself. When Caesar heard of the governor's delay, he took matters into his own hands. True to his word, he went to the prison where the pirates were being held, took them down to the coast, and had them all crucified. In what the historian Plutarch describes as an act of mercy, he ordered their throats to be cut first, to spare them a slow and agonizing death. The story spread like wildfire across the Roman world. It revealed the fundamental nature of Julius Caesar to everyone. It showed a man of absolute pride, of unshakable nerve, and of terrifyingly relentless determination. It proved that he was a man who, whether in jest or in earnest, always kept his promises. With his reputation now preceding him, Caesar returned to Rome, a city still recovering from the Sullan terror. He was ambitious and possessed a noble name, but he lacked the two things essential for real success in Roman politics: vast wealth and a powerful political faction. He had to build his influence from the ground up. He chose a classic path for a young, aspiring politician: the law courts. But Caesar didn't take on ordinary cases. In Rome, one of the quickest ways to gain public notoriety was to act as the prosecutor in a major trial, accusing a powerful governor or senator of corruption and extortion. These trials were grand public spectacles, and a brilliant speech could make a young man famous overnight. True to his nature, Caesar aimed high. He chose to prosecute two major senators, both of whom had been loyal supporters of the Sulla regime, for crimes committed during their time in office. It was an incredibly audacious move. The entire judicial system was still stacked with men who owed their careers to Sulla. The chances of securing a conviction were almost zero, and he knew it. As expected, he lost both cases. The powerful defendants were acquitted. But Caesar wasn't playing for a legal victory. He was playing for a political one. His speeches in the Roman Forum were masterful. Delivered with precision, passion, and eloquence, they laid bare the corruption of the ruling class in a way that captivated the common people. He attacked the accused with a ferocity that drew massive crowds. Though the powerful judges set the defendants free, the people of Rome saw something different. They saw a brave young aristocrat, unafraid to confront the corrupt elite. He had lost the verdict, but he had won the people. His name began to be spoken with admiration in the streets and tenements of the city. Having established his name, Caesar was ready to take his first formal step onto the cursus honorum, the ladder of offices. He was elected military tribune, a junior officer position that gave him more experience with the legions and was a prerequisite for higher office. It was during this period, however, that two deaths in his family gave him an unexpected opportunity to demonstrate his genius for political theater. The first was the death of his aunt Julia, the widow of the great Gaius Marius. During her public funeral procession, Caesar did something that left all of Rome speechless. Defying a ban that had been in place since the time of Sulla, he ordered that the death masks and battle standards of Marius be paraded through the streets. For over a decade, any image of Marius had been forbidden. Now, as the likeness of their old revered leader passed by, the veterans and supporters of the populace faction, who had lived in the shadows for years, began to weep with emotion. Some shouted their approval. It was a calculated and electrifying act of defiance. Caesar was sending a clear message to all of Rome. The party of the people was not dead, and he was prepared to be its new champion. Shortly thereafter, his beloved wife, Cornelia, passed away. It was a deep personal loss. At the time, grand public eulogies were reserved for older, distinguished women. It was not customary to give such a speech for a young wife. Caesar ignored this tradition. He stood on the rostra, the speaker's platform in the forum, and delivered a heartfelt and moving speech in honor of Cornelia. This gesture, which seemed on the surface to be a purely personal act of a grieving husband, was also a brilliant political stroke. It presented him to the public as a loyal, sensitive man, capable of deep feeling and devotion, in stark contrast to the cold and ruthless image of many of his political rivals. With these two funerals, Caesar had masterfully transformed his family's grief into political capital, further cementing his status as a rising star and a hero to the common people. Having established himself as a popular and fearless figure, Caesar was elected quaestor in 69 BC. This was the first official step on the cursus honorum and marked his formal entry into the Roman Senate. A quaestor was a financial administrator, and Caesar was assigned to serve in the province of Further Spain. This was his first significant experience in governing a large territory, managing public funds and administering justice. It was during his time in Spain that a famous incident occurred that revealed the sheer scale of his ambition. While visiting a temple in the city of Gades, modern-day Cadiz, he saw a statue of Alexander the Great. He reportedly stood before it for a long time before sighing deeply, almost weeping. When his companions asked him what was wrong, he replied, "Do you think I have not just cause to weep when I consider that Alexander at my age had conquered so many nations, and I have all this time done nothing that is memorable?" He was in his early 30s. Alexander was already master of the known world at that age. Caesar's ambition was not just to be a successful Roman senator. It was to rival the gods and heroes of history. He returned to Rome more determined than ever. His next major goal was the office of aedile. For a man like Caesar, this position was the perfect vehicle for his ambition. The aediles were the city commissioners of Rome. They were responsible for maintaining the temples, roads, and public buildings, but their most important and visible duty was to stage the public games and religious festivals. This was the primary form of mass entertainment for the Roman people, and a spectacular festival could make an aedile immensely popular. Caesar understood that this was his golden ticket to the heart of the Roman electorate, and he decided to put on a show that Rome would never forget. There was just one problem. Staging such a show required a fortune, and Caesar was far from wealthy. His solution was simple and breathtakingly audacious. He would borrow the money. He began to spend on a scale that was almost unbelievable, accumulating debts that would have crushed a dozen other senators. His primary creditor was the richest man in Rome, Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus, who had made his fortune through real estate speculation and silver mining, was a shrewd political investor. He saw in Caesar a man of immense talent and popularity, a high-risk political asset that could, if successful, yield enormous returns. He loaned Caesar staggering sums of money, funding the young politician's bid for popular acclaim. With Crassus's gold, Caesar unleashed a torrent of spectacle upon the city. He sponsored gladiatorial games so vast and magnificent that his political opponents in the Senate, unnerved by the sight of Caesar commanding what amounted to a private army of trained fighters, passed an emergency law to limit the number of gladiators that could participate. Undeterred, Caesar found a way to make them even more memorable. He had all 320 pairs of his gladiators fight in armor made of solid silver, a display of opulence that left the crowds gasping. He restored and redecorated the Appian Way, one of Rome's major highways. He adorned the Forum and the Capitoline Hill with temporary colonnades and art exhibits for the public's enjoyment. The city of Rome was in a state of constant festival, all courtesy of Julius Caesar. The strategy worked perfectly. The common citizen of Rome adored him. He was seen as generous, charismatic, and a man who understood their desires. He was giving them the bread and circuses they craved, and his popularity skyrocketed. But as his fame grew, so did the mountain of his debt, which had reached a truly astronomical figure. His enemies in the Senate, the Optimates, watched with a mixture of horror and disgust. They saw him as an utterly irresponsible demagogue, a populist showman who was buying his way to power with borrowed money. They despised him, but they were also beginning to fear him. Caesar was now playing the most dangerous game of his life. He was trapped. To pay his debts, he needed more power. To get more power, he needed to spend more money. He was betting everything on his ability to keep climbing the ladder, knowing that a single misstep, a single lost election, would mean instant ruin at the hands of his creditors and political foes. Caesar's spectacular year as aedile had made him the idol of the masses, but it had pushed him to the edge of a financial abyss. He was now so deeply in debt that he was a prisoner of his own ambition. He had to keep moving forward, to keep winning elections, because only the legal immunity granted by a high public office could protect him from his creditors, who could otherwise have him arrested and his property seized. He was walking on a knife's edge, and his next move had to be a masterstroke. Just then, an unexpected opportunity arose. The Pontifex Maximus, the chief high priest of Rome, died, leaving the most prestigious religious office in the Republic vacant. This was not an ordinary political position. Its importance was immense for several reasons. First, unlike the consulship or other magistracies which were held for only a single year, the office of Pontifex Maximus was an appointment for life. This guaranteed a stable and long-term source of influence and power. Second, it granted enormous prestige and moral authority. The Pontifex Maximus was the guardian of the Roman state religion, overseeing sacred rituals, the temples, and the revered Vestal Virgins. He also had control over the official Roman calendar, giving him the subtle but significant power to add or remove days to lengthen the term of a political ally or shorten that of an enemy. Finally, the position came with a very visible perk: an official state-owned house, the Domus Publica, located in a prime position in the very heart of the Roman Forum. To live there meant you were literally at the center of the Roman universe. Traditionally, this post was the final, crowning achievement for a venerable, elderly statesman, a universally respected figure who had already held all other major offices. The candidates who came forward were exactly this type of man: Quintus Lutatius Catulus and Publius Servilius Isauricus. Both were former consuls, leading figures of the Optimate faction, men of immense wealth and impeccable reputation. They were giants of Roman politics. And then, to the astonishment and mockery of the entire Roman elite, Gaius Julius Caesar, a relatively young man, famous mostly for his populist politics and his scandalous debts, announced his own candidacy. To the Senate, it was a bad joke, an act of unparalleled arrogance. But Caesar was not joking. He knew he stood no chance of winning the support of the aristocracy, so he poured all his efforts, and all the money he could possibly borrow, into appealing directly to the people. The election was decided by the votes of Rome's 35 tribes, and Caesar launched a campaign of bribery on a scale never seen before. The stakes could not have been higher. He was now so far in debt that this election was a matter of political life or death. The evening before the vote, one of his main rivals, Catulus, recognizing Caesar's immense popularity, allegedly offered him a massive bribe to withdraw from the race, simply to avoid the humiliation of competing against him. Caesar replied that if necessary, he would borrow even more money to beat him. On the morning of the election, as he prepared to leave his home, he kissed his mother, Aurelia, and told her, "Mother, today you will see your son either as Pontifex Maximus or as an exile." He knew there was no other outcome. If he lost, his creditors would immediately sue him for his debts, and he would be ruined, forced to flee Rome for good. The Roman elite awaited an easy victory for one of their champions. But as the results of the vote began to trickle in, their disbelief turned to panic, and then to horror. Caesar had not just won. He had obliterated his opponents. He received more votes than both of the other powerful candidates combined. The victory was a political earthquake. It was a complete and utter humiliation for the Optimates, and a terrifying demonstration of the power Caesar had accumulated among the people of Rome. They could no longer dismiss him as a mere rabble-rouser. For Caesar, the triumph was total. As Pontifex Maximus, he now had lifelong legal immunity. His creditors could no longer touch him. He was safe. His status soared, and his new official residence in the Forum made him a constant, unavoidable presence at the very heart of Roman power. Saved from the financial abyss and established as a figure of the first rank, Caesar now had the security and the platform to aim for the final steps on the ladder of honor. With the lifelong prestige and immunity of the Pontifex Maximus now secured, Caesar continued his ascent. In 62 BC, he was elected praetor, a senior judicial office that placed him among Rome's top magistrates for the year. His term was turbulent, marked by constant opposition from his obstinate enemies in the Senate. They were led by a new and formidable opponent, Marcus Porcius Cato, known to history as Cato the Younger. Cato was a man of rigid principles, a staunch defender of traditional republican values, and he saw Caesar as a dangerous populist who threatened to destroy everything he held sacred. He would become Caesar's most relentless and unforgiving political adversary. During Caesar's praetorship, his enemies tried to implicate him in the Catilinarian conspiracy, a failed and bloody attempt by a disgruntled nobleman to overthrow the state. While Caesar had likely communicated with the conspirators, no concrete evidence of his involvement could be found, and the charges were eventually dropped, but the incident showed how determined his foes were to destroy him. After his year in office, Caesar was assigned to govern the province of Further Spain. This was his chance to finally command legions, win military glory, and most importantly, make a fortune to pay off his still staggering debts. But there was a problem. As he prepared to leave Rome, a group of his creditors physically blocked his path, refusing to let him go until he paid them. Caesar was trapped. His public career was about to end in humiliation before it had even truly taken off. In this moment of crisis, he was saved once again by Marcus Licinius Crassus. The wealthy magnate saw that his investment was on the verge of collapse. He stepped in and paid off the most pressing of Caesar's debts, acting as a guarantor for the rest. It was a clear demonstration of their deepening alliance. Crassus was still betting that Caesar's political career would one day make him powerful enough to be a valuable ally. Finally free to leave, Caesar traveled to Spain and took command of his legions. And there, he proved that he was far more than just a city politician. He was a natural commander. He did not spend his term quietly administering the province. Instead, he launched a swift and aggressive military campaign against the independent tribes of the mountainous north and west, regions that had never been fully subdued by Rome. He proved to be a brilliant and energetic general, leading his men from the front, sharing their hardships, and earning their loyalty and admiration. He marched his army all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. His campaign was a resounding success, pacifying the region and, just as importantly, generating an enormous amount of plunder. He was able to send a vast fortune back to the Roman treasury, enrich his soldiers, and finally, after so many years, pay off every last one of his personal debts. He was, for the first time in his adult life, financially solvent. He returned to the outskirts of Rome in 60 BC a victorious general. By tradition, his victories entitled him to the highest honor a Roman commander could receive: a triumph, a glorious military parade through the streets of the city, with his soldiers, prisoners, and spoils of war on display for all to see. There was just one catch. To be eligible for a triumph, a general had to remain under arms with his army outside the sacred boundary of Rome. He could not enter the city as a private citizen. At the exact same time, however, elections were being held for the consulship, the final and most powerful office in the Republic. To run for consul, a candidate was legally required to register his name in person, in the forum, which meant entering the city as a private citizen. His enemies in the Senate, led by Cato, knew this. They saw a way to trap him. They deliberately stalled, using procedural delays to postpone the Senate's authorization of his triumph until after the deadline for the consular registration had passed. They wanted to force him to choose. He could have his day of glory in a parade, or he could have a shot at real power. He could not have both. For Caesar, the choice was clear. Glory was fleeting, but power was absolute. In a decision that stunned many but demonstrated his clear-eyed pragmatism, he relinquished his command, gave up his right to a triumph, and walked into the city as a private citizen to formally declare his candidacy for consul. He had sacrificed the ultimate symbol of military honor for the chance to win the ultimate prize in Roman politics. This calculated sacrifice set the stage for him to forge the most powerful, and most dangerous political alliance Rome had ever seen. By renouncing his triumph for the chance to run for consul, Caesar had made his priorities clear. But he was a political realist. He knew that even if he won the election, his enemies in the Senate, with Cato leading the charge, would do everything in their power to neutralize him. They would try to assign him a meaningless provincial command after his year in office, block his legislation, and generally make his consulship a powerless failure. The conservative Optimate faction had become masters of obstruction, dedicated to blocking any individual who accumulated too much personal power or popularity. In their zeal to protect the Republic's traditions, they had brought its government to a grinding halt. Caesar realized he could not break this senatorial blockade on his own. But he also realized that he was not the only powerful man in Rome who was being frustrated by it. There were two others. The first was Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, or Pompey the Great. Pompey was, without a doubt, the most admired and successful general of his generation. His military achievements were the stuff of legend. In a lightning campaign, he had swept the Mediterranean clean of the pirates who had plagued it for decades. He had then marched east, conquering new kingdoms, defeating foreign kings, and adding vast wealthy territories to Rome's empire. He had reorganized the entire eastern frontier with breathtaking efficiency. The people of Rome adored him. He was their Alexander, their undisputed hero. And yet, when this great conqueror returned to Rome, he was met not with gratitude, but with suspicion and humiliation. The Senate, deeply jealous of his success and terrified of the influence he commanded over his loyal legions, refused to ratify the treaties and settlements he had so carefully arranged in the East. Even more insulting, they denied his primary request, to pass a law granting plots of farmland to the thousands of veteran soldiers who had fought and bled for him. The greatest general of his age was politically impotent in his own capital. The second man was Marcus Licinius Crassus. If Pompey possessed military glory, Crassus possessed the power of money. He was, by a vast margin, the wealthiest man in the Republic. His fortune, built through shrewd real estate deals during Sulla's proscriptions, silver mining, and above all moneylending, was legendary. It was said he could personally fund an entire army from his own pocket. While he had achieved military distinction by crushing the slave revolt of Spartacus, he desperately craved the one thing his money could not buy: the same level of public adoration and military prestige that Pompey enjoyed. He too was frustrated by the Senate, which was blocking financial legislation that benefited his powerful business partners, the class of public contractors and tax collectors known as the equites. So the situation was this: the three most powerful and ambitious men in Rome, Caesar, the masterful populist politician, Pompey, the celebrated military hero, and Crassus, the billionaire tycoon, were all being blocked by the very same force: the conservative oligarchy of the Senate. These three men were natural rivals. Pompey and Crassus, in particular, despised one another. It was Caesar, with his unique genius for political strategy, who saw the opportunity in this stalemate. He approached both men separately and proposed a radical plan. He explained to them that as long as they fought amongst themselves, the Senate would always win by playing them off against each other. But, he argued, if they were to secretly join forces, if they were to combine Caesar's immense popularity with the common people, Pompey's legions of loyal veterans, and Crassus's bottomless reserves of gold, they would form an unstoppable political force. Together, they could bypass the Senate, take control of the state, and ensure that all their demands were met. The deal was struck in secret in the year 60 BC. This was not an official public office. It was a private pact, a gentleman's agreement between three men to pool their resources and advance their mutual interests. History would come to call it the First Triumvirate. Their first objective was simple and immediate: to use their combined influence to ensure that Gaius Julius Caesar was elected consul for the upcoming year. Once in power, it would be his job to force through the legislation that would satisfy his new partners. The Roman Republic was about to be secretly hijacked by a three-man shadow government, and the Senate never saw the coup coming. Thanks to the combined power of the Triumvirate, the first objective of the secret pact was achieved. In 59 BC, Gaius Julius Caesar was elected consul, the highest office in the Roman Republic. However, his obstinate enemies managed to score one small victory. They poured enormous bribes into the election to ensure that the other consul elected alongside Caesar was one of their own, a deeply conservative and famously stubborn man named Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus. His sole mission for the year was to veto and obstruct everything Caesar tried to accomplish. True to his agreement with his partners, the first piece of legislation Caesar introduced to the Senate was the land law, a bill to grant public land to Pompey's thousands of discharged veterans. Just as he had anticipated, his enemies, with Cato leading the way, immediately began to block it. They used a tactic known as the filibuster, taking the floor to speak and then refusing to yield, talking for hours and days on end to ensure the bill could never be brought to a vote. They were prepared to paralyze the government for the entire year to stop Caesar. But Caesar had no intention of playing by the old rules. In a radical and unprecedented move, he announced he was withdrawing his proposal from the Senate and taking it directly to the People's Assembly for a public vote. While technically legal, this was seen as a profound insult to the Senate's authority, a tactic used by the most extreme populists. It was a declaration of political war. The day of the vote in the Roman Forum was explosive. Bibulus, his fellow consul, arrived to try and stop the proceedings. He exercised his sacred power as a magistrate to declare that he was watching the skies for omens. This was a religious veto, a holy instrument that was supposed to immediately suspend all public business. But Caesar was ready. At that moment, the great public square began to fill with Pompey's veterans. They were hard, intimidating men, fresh from a decade of war in the East. They carried no weapons, but their organized silent presence was a more potent threat than any open display of force. The situation quickly spiraled out of control. The crowd loyal to Caesar surged forward, attacking Bibulus and his obstinate supporters. They broke his fasces, the ceremonial bundle of rods that symbolized his consular authority. In a final degrading act of public humiliation, a basket of dung was dumped over his head. Terrified and utterly disgraced, Bibulus fled the forum and locked himself in his house. He would not appear in public again for the entire rest of the year. From his self-imposed house arrest, he would regularly issue decrees claiming that the omens remained unfavorable, a desperate attempt to legally nullify everything Caesar was doing. But it was useless. No one paid him the slightest attention. Rome was now effectively under the control of a single consul. In the streets, a popular joke began to circulate. Romans, with their characteristic dark humor, started dating their documents not as from the consulship of Bibulus and Caesar, but from the consulship of Julius and Caesar. With his opposition removed, Caesar acted with lightning speed and ruthless efficiency. He became, in effect, the sole ruler of Rome. He pushed his land bill through the popular assembly, fulfilling his promise to Pompey. He then had all of Pompey's treaties and settlements in the East ratified. He passed the financial laws that his other partner, Crassus, desired. To further bolster his own popularity, he passed other reforms, including a groundbreaking law that required the detailed minutes of Senate debates to be published for the public to read. It was a revolutionary act of transparency that allowed the common people to see exactly what their leaders were saying and doing. His consulship was incredibly productive, but it was also a brutal and largely illegal affair. He had used intimidation and violence to sideline his colleague, ignored sacred religious traditions, and completely trampled on the authority of the Senate. He had secured the gratitude of the two most powerful men in Rome and the adoration of the people. But he had also earned the permanent, unforgiving hatred of the aristocracy. Caesar was acutely aware that the moment his year in office ended and his legal immunity expired, his enemies would be waiting. They would drag him into the courts, prosecute him for his countless illegal acts, and utterly destroy him. He needed to protect himself. He needed a new office, a multi-year command in a province that would not only keep his immunity intact, but would also give him what he now needed most, an army of his own. As his year as consul drew to a close, Caesar knew the clock was ticking. His enemies in the Senate were sharpening their knives, preparing a flood of lawsuits to destroy him the moment he became a private citizen. His only salvation was to secure a position as a proconsul, the governor of a Roman province. This position would grant him imperium, the authority to command an army, and crucially would extend his legal immunity. As long as he was at the head of legions, representing the state, no one could drag him into court. The Senate made one last attempt to humiliate and contain him. Traditionally, they assigned the most important provinces to the outgoing consuls. In a final act of spite, they assigned Caesar the insignificant task of supervising the forests and country lanes of Italy. It was a domestic post with no army, no chance for glory, and no real power. It was a cage, designed to keep him leashed and under their control. But Caesar had no intention of accepting this fate. He once again relied on the power of the triumvirate, using the same tactic he had employed during his consulship. An allied politician proposed a law directly to the People's Assembly, completely bypassing the Senate. This law granted Caesar a far more desirable command: the provinces of Cisalpine Gaul in northern Italy and Illyricum along the Adriatic coast. Most importantly, the command was not for the usual one-year term, but for an extraordinary period of 5 years. This guaranteed him safety and power for a long time. Then, in a stroke of incredible luck, the governor of a third province, Transalpine Gaul, a strip of Roman territory in what is now the south of France, died unexpectedly. That province, which bordered the independent Gallic tribes, was quickly added to his command. The result was a stunning victory for Caesar and a devastating defeat for his enemies. They had tried to trap him in a meaningless job, and had instead handed him control of a vast, strategic area on Rome's northern border. With that territory came the command of a formidable army of 4 legions, about 20,000 professional soldiers. The choice of Gaul was no accident. While other provinces, like those in the wealthy and civilized East, might have seemed more attractive, Gaul was the perfect stage for Caesar's specific ambitions. First and foremost, it offered the near certainty of war. And for an ambitious Roman of his era, war was the ultimate source of everything that mattered. Military glory, which the Romans called dignitas, was the highest form of honor. A victorious general who expanded the frontiers of Rome and defeated its barbarian enemies was hailed as a national hero. His reputation would be unassailable. War was also incredibly profitable. The spoils from looted cities, the sale of tens of thousands of captives into the slave market, and the control of new resources like gold mines could generate a personal fortune beyond imagination. It would be more than enough for Caesar to secure his financial future and buy all the political influence he could ever need. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, a long and difficult war would allow him to do what Marius and Sulla had done before him: to forge a veteran army, hardened by years of brutal warfare, and fanatically loyal not to the Senate or the Republic, but to him. He would be loyal to the general who shared their hardships, who led them to victory, and who made them rich. This army would be his ultimate guarantee of security, his final insurance policy against his enemies in Rome. In 58 BC, at the age of 42, Julius Caesar left behind the backstabbing politics of the capital and departed for his provinces. Many in the Senate breathed a sigh of relief. They were happy to see this troublesome agitator go, shipping him off to a dangerous and uncertain frontier. They hoped he might fail, that he would be defeated and killed by some Gallic tribe, or that he would simply fade into obscurity. They had absolutely no idea that the controversial politician who was riding north would return 9 years later, transformed into the greatest conqueror Rome had ever seen, at the head of an invincible army, ready to claim absolute power for himself. The Gallic command was not the end of his story. It was the true beginning. When Caesar arrived in Gaul in 58 BC, he was a politician in a general's cloak, a man whose reputation had been built in the forum, not on the battlefield. His official mission was to defend Rome's existing provinces, but his real objective was conquest. For that, he needed a casus belli, a reason to wage war, and he did not have to wait long. The opportunity was delivered to him by a large tribe known as the Helvetii, who inhabited the area of modern-day Switzerland. Feeling pressured by Germanic tribes and believing their own lands were too small, they made a drastic decision. They would burn their own villages and towns to the ground and migrate as an entire people to new, more fertile lands near the Atlantic coast. Their simplest and most direct route passed straight through the Roman province. For Caesar, this mass migration was not a refugee crisis. It was a gift from the gods of war. He immediately framed the movement to the Senate as a grave and imminent threat to Roman security, claiming the Helvetii were a warlike people who would cause chaos on their borders. While the Helvetii themselves simply asked for peaceful passage, Caesar had his excuse. He now demonstrated the quality that would become his military trademark: incredible speed, or celeritas. He raced from Italy to Geneva in just over a week, a journey that normally took a month. Upon arriving, he ordered the bridge over the Rhone River to be destroyed. Then, in a stunning display of Roman engineering, his legions, working around the clock, constructed a fortified wall of earth and timber nearly 19 miles long, complete with towers and forts, to physically block the Helvetii's path. It was an astonishing feat, completed in less than a fortnight. Forced to take a longer, more difficult route, the slow-moving column of Helvetii migrants was now vulnerable. Caesar raised new legions, pursued them, and relentlessly harassed their rear guard, cutting off their supplies. Finally, he forced them into a pitched battle near the town of Bibracte. Here, the superior discipline and tactics of the Roman legions proved decisive. Caesar's army annihilated the Helvetii forces. He then ordered the exhausted and starving survivors to return to their burned homeland, cleverly reasoning that they would now serve as a useful buffer against the Germanic tribes to the north. In his first campaign, Caesar had not only won a great victory, but had masterfully spun it as a defensive war where he had saved Rome from a barbarian invasion. His triumph sent shockwaves through Gaul. Other Gallic tribes, impressed by his power and decisiveness, came to him for aid. They had a bigger problem: a formidable Germanic king named Ariovistus, who had led his Suebi tribe across the Rhine River, settled in Gallic territory, and was now dominating and terrorizing the local tribes who were allies of Rome. Once again, Caesar saw a golden opportunity. He immediately positioned himself as the champion of the Gauls against the German aggressors. He first tried diplomacy, sending arrogant messages to Ariovistus, demanding he withdraw his people back across the Rhine. Ariovistus, a proud and proven warrior king, laughed off the threats. War was inevitable. But as Caesar ordered his legions to march against the Germans, for the first time, his own soldiers hesitated. The Romans held an almost superstitious fear of the Germanic warriors, who were legendary for their size, ferocity, and wild courage. Panic began to spread through the Roman camp. Centurions reported that their men were making wills, and some officers were openly speaking of mutiny. It was here that Caesar proved his most powerful weapon was not his sword, but his words. He summoned all his centurions and delivered a masterful speech. He shamed them for their cowardice, asking them since when did a soldier question his general's orders. He reminded them of their past victories and of Roman valor. Then, in a stroke of psychological genius, he declared that if no one else would follow him, he would march on the enemy alone with only his most beloved and loyal legion, the 10th, a unit he trusted completely. The speech had an electric effect. The men of the 10th Legion were swelled with pride. The soldiers of the other legions were overcome with shame, terrified of being seen as less brave than their comrades. They begged their officers to tell Caesar they were ready, that they would follow him anywhere. His army's morale restored, Caesar led them to a brutal and decisive battle. Roman discipline again overcame ferocious courage, and his legions crushed the forces of Ariovistus, pursuing the survivors all the way to the Rhine and driving the Germans out of Gaul. In a single campaign season, Caesar had defeated two of Rome's most feared enemies and established himself as the ultimate arbiter of power in Gaul. His legend as a military genius had just been born. After his initial victories, Caesar spent the next several years systematically subjugating the remaining tribes of Gaul. He conquered the Belgic peoples in the north, the coastal tribes of the Atlantic, and launched his famous, headline-grabbing expeditions across the Rhine River into Germany and across the sea to Britain. By the winter of 53 BC, after 6 years of relentless campaigning, Caesar believed that Gaul was finally pacified. His confidence was so high that he followed his usual custom, leaving his legions quartered for the winter and crossing the Alps into Italy to attend to his political affairs. It was a grave miscalculation. He had not conquered the Gauls. He had only suppressed them. Beneath the surface of Roman peace, resentment was burning like a fever. The Gallic people were fiercely independent, and they had lost everything: their freedom, their warriors, their land, and their wealth. They were now paying tribute to a foreign power. All they needed was a leader, a spark to ignite the simmering anger into an inferno. That spark was about to arrive. The rebellion was led by a man who would become Caesar's greatest and most formidable adversary, Vercingetorix. He was a young nobleman from the powerful Arverni tribe, charismatic, eloquent, and possessed of a strategic vision that no Gallic leader before him had ever conceived. Vercingetorix understood the fundamental truth of the Roman conquest. The Gauls had always been defeated because they had never been united. While each tribe worried only about its own territory, Caesar had been able to pick them off one by one. Vercingetorix traveled from tribe to tribe, preaching a new and powerful message of unity. He urged them to forget their ancient rivalries, to put aside their petty squabbles, and to join together under a single banner to fight for a common cause: the liberty of all Gaul. His call was heard. The revolt began with a massacre of Roman merchants in the town of Cenabum. The news, carried by horsemen at incredible speed, was the signal. Across central Gaul, tribes rose in arms and proclaimed Vercingetorix their supreme commander. The Gallic leader was also a brilliant strategist. He knew that facing Caesar's legions in a traditional pitched battle was suicide. So he devised a new, brutal kind of warfare. First, guerrilla tactics. Swift cavalry raids and ambushes designed to cut Roman supply lines and bleed the enemy dry. And second, a terrible but effective scorched earth policy. Vercingetorix convinced his own people to make the ultimate sacrifice. They were to systematically burn their own farms, their own villages, and their own grain stores that lay in the path of Caesar's advancing army. The objective was to starve the legions, to deny them any food, fodder, or shelter in the harsh Gallic winter. News of the massive revolt reached Caesar in Italy. His reaction was immediate and legendary. In the dead of winter, he traveled with only a small escort, crossing the Alps and then the Cevennes mountains, which were covered in 6 feet of snow, a journey widely considered to be impossible. He rejoined his legions before they could be isolated and destroyed one by one. But this time, the war was different. The Romans found themselves marching through a devastated, blackened landscape, constantly harassed by Vercingetorix's cavalry. For the first time in Gaul, Caesar's military genius was matched by that of his opponent. And for the first time, Caesar suffered a major personal defeat. After successfully taking the town of Avaricum, he laid siege to Gergovia, the fortified capital of Vercingetorix's own tribe. In the assault, his legions were bloodily repulsed, suffering hundreds of casualties, including nearly 50 of his best centurions. The defeat at Gergovia was a devastating psychological blow. News that the invincible Caesar had finally been beaten spread like wildfire. The rebellion grew even stronger. Tribes that had been loyal Roman allies for years, like the Aedui, now abandoned Caesar and joined Vercingetorix. Caesar's situation was desperate. He was trapped deep in the heart of a hostile continent, heavily outnumbered, with his supply routes severed and the morale of his army at an all-time low. Nearly all of Gaul was now united against him. His conquest of almost 7 years, his fortune, his reputation, and even his life itself were all hanging by a single fragile thread. Following his defeat at Gergovia, Caesar was in the weakest position of his entire time in Gaul. He decided to regroup his legions and march south, towards the relative safety of the Roman province. Vercingetorix, emboldened by his recent victory, made the single fatal mistake of his campaign. Believing he could annihilate the weakened Romans in open country, he launched his massive cavalry force against Caesar's retreating column. But Caesar, reinforced by his lethal German mercenary cavalry, not only repelled the attack but utterly crushed the Gallic horsemen. This unexpected defeat forced Vercingetorix to change his strategy. He retreated with his entire army, some 80,000 warriors, to a nearly impregnable natural fortress, the Gallic hill fort or oppidum of Alesia. His plan was to wait there, well supplied, until a new relief army marshaled from every corner of Gaul could arrive to trap and destroy the Romans. When Caesar arrived before Alesia, he assessed the situation. A direct assault on the steep-sloped fortress would be a suicidal bloodbath. So, he made one of the most audacious and ambitious decisions in all of military history. If he could not take the hill by storm, he would seal it off from the outside world. He ordered his legions to construct a gigantic line of siege works that would encircle the entire hill. It was a monumental undertaking of military engineering. In a matter of weeks, his approximately 50,000 legionaries built a wall, complete with towers, ditches, and ramparts, that stretched for 11 miles. But this was no simple wall. They turned the ground in front of it into a death zone, filled with layers of deadly traps. They dug trenches that they filled with water. They planted sharpened stakes in hidden pits, which they called lilies. They embedded iron barbs in wooden blocks and buried them just below the surface, calling them spurs. The objective was simple and brutal: to lock Vercingetorix in and starve his massive army into submission. But the Gallic leader had managed to send his cavalrymen to ride for help before the ring of fortifications was complete. They carried a desperate message to all the tribes of Gaul. They must unite one last time, march on Alesia, and crush the trapped Roman army. And Gaul responded. A few weeks later, a colossal relief army, which ancient sources number at more than 250,000 warriors, appeared on the horizon. Caesar's situation had become a living nightmare. He was now the one who was trapped. He had 80,000 enemy warriors to his front, inside Alesia, and a massive army of 250,000 at his back. He was caught in a vice. It was at this moment that he gave his most incredible order. He commanded his legions to build a second line of fortifications, this one even longer, 13 miles, but facing outwards to protect themselves from the relief army. The Romans were now in an almost unbelievable position. They were the besiegers and, at the same time, the besieged. The climax arrived in a final desperate battle that raged for several days. The Romans, outnumbered perhaps 5 to 1, were forced to fight on two fronts simultaneously. Vercingetorix's army stormed out of Alesia, attacking the inner wall, while the immense relief force threw themselves against the outer wall. The exhausted legionaries raced from one section of the defenses to another, fighting for their very lives. At the most critical moment of the battle, when a section of the outer wall was about to collapse under a massive Gallic assault, Caesar himself, unmistakable in his brilliant red commander's cloak, gathered his last reserves. He personally led a cavalry charge that smashed into the flank of the attacking Gauls. The psychological impact of the surprise attack, led by the enemy commander-in-chief, was devastating. Panic erupted in the Gallic ranks, and the gigantic relief army shattered and fled in a disorganized rout. From the walls of Alesia, Vercingetorix watched it all. He saw the last hope for a free Gaul dissolve into chaos. The next day, knowing there was no escape, he surrendered. Legend says he dressed in his most splendid armor, mounted his warhorse, rode out to the Roman camp, and threw his weapons down at the feet of a silent Julius Caesar. The great rebellion was over. The victory at Alesia was Caesar's masterpiece, a triumph of engineering, discipline, and a will that simply refused to accept defeat. The surrender of Vercingetorix at Alesia broke the back of the Great Gallic Rebellion, but it did not end the war. Though their unified army was gone, desperate pockets of resistance still held out across Gaul, refusing to accept Roman rule. Caesar spent the entirety of the next year, 51 BC, in a series of grueling and often brutal mopping-up operations. He and his legions marched relentlessly from one end of Gaul to the other, stamping out the last embers of the revolt. This was not a war of glorious, pitched battles, but of difficult sieges against tribes who were fighting with the courage of despair. At the siege of Uxellodunum, the last major holdout, Caesar showed the ruthless side of his character. After the town finally surrendered due to his clever tactic of cutting off their water supply, Caesar decided he needed to make a final, terrifying example. He wanted to ensure that Gaul would never dare to rise against him again. He gathered all the surviving warriors who had defended the town, and instead of killing or enslaving them, he ordered that their hands be cut off. He then sent these mutilated men back to their homes across Gaul, to serve as a living, gruesome testament to the price of rebellion against Rome. It was a calculated act of terror, and it worked. Organized resistance in Gaul ceased. Yet once the fighting was over, Caesar's policy was surprisingly lenient and politically astute. He did not treat Gaul as a broken land to be plundered into oblivion. There were no mass executions of the nobility, no crushing taxes imposed upon the people. Instead, he skillfully co-opted the Gallic aristocracy, making them his partners in the new Roman order. He respected their local customs and granted Roman citizenship to many of his Gallic allies. This wise policy won him the loyalty of the Gallic leadership and ensured that Gaul would remain a peaceful and integrated part of the Roman world for centuries to come. He had arrived as a conqueror, but he would now rule as a statesman. By the end of his campaigns in 50 BC, the results of his 9 years in Gaul were staggering. He had conquered a vast territory, adding the entirety of modern-day France, Belgium, and parts of Switzerland and Germany to the Roman Republic. Ancient sources, likely with some exaggeration, claimed he had fought against 3 million men, killing 1 million and enslaving another million. The sheer amount of plunder he had seized was almost beyond comprehension. So much gold was brought back to Italy from the looted temples and mines of Gaul that its market price temporarily dropped by 25%. After a lifetime of debt, Caesar was now one of the wealthiest men in Rome. But his greatest prize was his army. The 4 legions he had started with had grown to a force of 10, and later 12. These were not the inexperienced recruits of 9 years prior. They were the finest soldiers in the world, hardened veterans who had survived brutal winters, built impossible fortifications, and won unimaginable victories from the shores of Britain to the forests of Germany. Their endurance was legendary, and their loyalty was absolute. They cared nothing for the Senate or the abstract ideals of the Republic. Their loyalty was to one man and one man alone: Caesar. He was the commander who had shared their rations, who knew his centurions by name, and who had led them to unparalleled glory and riches. This army was now the most powerful military force on the planet. Throughout this entire period, Caesar had also been waging a brilliant propaganda war. He meticulously documented his campaigns in a series of reports sent back to Rome, which would become known as his Commentarii de Bello Gallico, the commentaries on the Gallic War. Written in a spare, direct, third-person style where he referred to himself only as Caesar, the book was a masterpiece of political spin. It portrayed his actions in the best possible light, casting him as a brilliant, merciful, and decisive general who was always acting in the best interests and defense of Rome. These accounts were read eagerly by the public in the Forum, cementing his status as a living legend long before his return. Now, after 9 years, the Conqueror was ready to come home. He was no longer a controversial politician fleeing his debts. He was Rome's greatest hero, fantastically wealthy, and at the head of an invincible army that adored him. The stage was now set for the final, inevitable confrontation with his rivals in Rome. While Caesar was spending the better part of a decade conquering Gaul, the political landscape back in Rome had shifted dramatically and dangerously against him. The very foundation of his power, the First Triumvirate, had crumbled to dust. Marcus Crassus, the great financier of the alliance, had sought his own measure of military glory to rival that of his partners. He launched a massive invasion of the wealthy Parthian Empire in the east. His adventure ended in one of the most catastrophic disasters in Roman history. At the Battle of Carrhae, Crassus was defeated and killed, and his army was annihilated. With his death, the financial pillar of the triumvirate, the man who had served as a crucial buffer between the towering ambitions of Caesar and Pompey, was gone. An even more personal link had also been broken. Julia, Caesar's beloved daughter and Pompey's wife, had died in childbirth. Her death was not just a family tragedy. It severed the last most human bond that connected the two most powerful men in Rome. The alliance was no longer held together by blood, only by ambition. Pompey the Great, now the sole major power in the capital, watched Caesar's superhuman successes in Gaul with growing envy and fear. The adulation the people of Rome were showering on Caesar was once reserved for him. He began to see his former partner not as an ally, but as a dangerous rival who threatened to eclipse him. The conservative optimates in the Senate, led by the implacable Cato, saw their opportunity. They had always despised Pompey as a populist strongman, but now they changed their strategy. They embraced him, championing him as the defender of the Republic, the only man with the military prestige and power to stop Caesar. Pompey, flattered by this newfound senatorial support and genuinely fearful of Caesar's growing power, accepted his new role. The two former allies were now on an unavoidable collision course. The final confrontation was triggered as Caesar's command in Gaul neared its end. He wanted to run for his second consulship, but he was caught in a legal trap. Roman law required a candidate to be present in Rome as a private citizen to register. But Caesar knew that the instant he laid down his command and stepped into the city, losing his legal immunity, his enemies would pounce. They had a long list of charges prepared, stemming from his illegal actions during his first consulship, and they would use them to end his career and likely his life. Caesar proposed a reasonable compromise: allow him to stand for the consulship in absentia, while he retained command of his legions until the election. This would ensure his personal safety. The Senate, spurred on by Pompey and Cato, flatly refused. Their position was absolute. They issued Caesar a stark ultimatum. He was to disband his legions immediately, hand over his provinces to his successor, and return to Rome as a private citizen. If he did not comply, he would be declared an enemy of the state. Caesar sent back one final, desperate counteroffer. He would disband his army of 8 legions if Pompey, who currently commanded 7 legions in Spain, did the same. This would put them on equal footing. Again, the Senate refused. They did not want equality. They wanted Caesar's unconditional surrender. In early January of 49 BC, the confrontation reached its breaking point. The Senate passed the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, a declaration of martial law, effectively giving Pompey dictatorial powers to defend the Republic from Caesar. The news rushed to Caesar in the town of Ravenna, in his province on the border of Italy. With him was only a single legion, the 13th. Before him lay a small, insignificant river called the Rubicon. This river was not a major geographical barrier, but it was a sacred and legal one. It marked the official boundary between Caesar's province and the Italian heartland. Roman law was absolute and unambiguous. No general was permitted to cross the Rubicon with an army in arms. To do so was not just illegal. It was an act of insurrection, of treason. It was a formal declaration of war against his own country. Ancient historians say that Caesar paused for hours on the riverbank, tormented by the decision before him. To retreat meant accepting his own personal and political ruin. To advance meant plunging the entire Roman world into the horror of a fratricidal civil war. Finally, he made his choice. Looking at his officers, he spoke the famous words that have echoed through history. Alia iacta est, the die is cast. He gave the order to advance. At the sound of the trumpets, the legionaries of the 13th marched across the bridge. With every step, they were taking an irreversible step towards war. The man who had conquered Gaul for Rome was now marching to conquer Rome itself. The news that Caesar had crossed the Rubicon and was marching south with his legions spread like a wildfire across Italy, igniting panic and confusion. His enemies in the Senate had completely misjudged their man. They had expected him to hesitate, to negotiate, or perhaps that his troops, supposedly weary after 9 years of war in Gaul, would refuse to follow him into a civil war against their own country. They were wrong on every count. Caesar advanced with the same terrifying speed that had served him so well in Gaul. He swept down the Italian peninsula, capturing town after town, often before their defenses could even be organized. The people of Rome, with the memory of the bloody purges of Marius and Sulla still fresh in their minds, expected a monster. They expected a wave of executions, confiscations, and revenge. Instead, Caesar unleashed a new and far more powerful political weapon: clementia, or mercy. Unlike the tyrants who had come before him, Caesar showed calculated and conspicuous forgiveness. To the towns that opened their gates to him, he offered protection and respect. When he captured enemy soldiers, he gave them a choice: join his army or simply go home in peace. When he captured prominent senators who had sworn to fight him to the death, he did not execute them. He pardoned them and set them free. This policy was a masterstroke of political genius. While his enemies were trying to portray him as a would-be king and a bloodthirsty tyrant, his actions demonstrated the exact opposite. He appeared magnanimous, reasonable, and forgiving. It was a psychological campaign that devastated his opponents. City after city went over to his side, won over by his reputation for mercy. Enemy soldiers, seeing that their captured comrades were being treated with kindness, began to desert in large numbers. It is hard to fight a man who refuses to act like the monster you have been told he is. In Rome, the panic was total. Pompey the Great, who had boasted to the Senate that he only needed to stamp his foot on the ground for legions loyal to him to spring from the earth, found that the earth was not responding. The reality was that he was completely unprepared for an invasion. His main, veteran legions were thousands of miles away, stationed in Spain. He had no army in Italy capable of stopping Caesar's hardened veterans from Gaul. Seeing that he could not defend the city, Pompey made a drastic but strategically sound decision. He would abandon Italy. He and the majority of the senators fled Rome in a chaotic exodus, heading south. They took with them the state treasury and gathered at the port of Brundisium, on the heel of Italy. There, they commandeered ships and sailed across the Adriatic Sea to Greece. Pompey's plan was logical. In the eastern provinces of the empire, Greece, Asia Minor, and Syria, his name was revered and his influence was immense. There, he could recruit a gigantic army from the local kingdoms and client states. He could use the powerful Roman navy, which was largely loyal to him, to blockade Italy, cutting off its vital grain supply and starving his enemy into submission. Then, once his forces were assembled, he could launch a massive counter-invasion and crush Caesar. Caesar arrived in Brundisium just in time to see the last of Pompey's ships disappearing over the horizon. In the space of just 60 days, without having to fight a single major battle, he had conquered the entire Italian peninsula. He was the master of the capital. But his primary target, his great rival, had escaped. Everyone, including his own officers, expected Caesar to immediately assemble a fleet and pursue Pompey to Greece for a final, decisive confrontation. But once again, Caesar did the completely unexpected. In one of the most brilliant strategic pivots of his career, he decided to turn his back on his main enemy and march his army in the opposite direction, towards Spain. His logic, which he explained to his allies, was impeccable, and he summarized it in a famous phrase. "I am going," he said, "to fight an army without a general, so that I can then return to fight a general without an army." Pompey may have been in Greece, but his most powerful, most experienced veteran legions were still in Spain. If Caesar sailed for Greece, those legions could invade Italy from the west, catching him in a deadly pincer movement. Before he dealt with the general, he would first have to eliminate his army. Caesar's campaign in Spain was a masterpiece of speed and maneuver. In just 40 days, he accomplished what should have taken months, if not years. He didn't seek a bloody, head-on confrontation with Pompey's powerful legions. Instead, at the key engagement near the town of Alerta, he used his army's superior engineering skills and a series of brilliant flanking marches to surround and trap the entire Pompeian force. He cut off their supply lines and, most critically, their access to water. Without having to fight a major battle, he forced the entire army to surrender. True to his now famous policy of clementia, he pardoned every single soldier and officer. He made them lay down their arms, and then he simply sent them home. With this single, swift campaign, he had neutralized Pompey's greatest military asset, an army of hardened veterans, without losing more than a handful of his own men. The western half of the Mediterranean was now secure. He could finally concentrate all his forces on the final confrontation with the general himself. He returned to Italy and then, in the dead of winter, did what his enemies thought was impossible. He gathered his legions and sailed them across the Adriatic Sea, evading Pompey's much larger naval blockade to land his army on the shores of Greece. He had a much smaller force than his rival. Pompey the Great had spent the better part of a year assembling a massive army, drawing legions from the eastern provinces and hiring thousands of auxiliaries and cavalry from allied kingdoms. The atmosphere in Pompey's camp was one of arrogant overconfidence. Dozens of high-ranking senators were with him, already arguing amongst themselves over who would get Caesar's position as Pontifex Maximus and how they would punish his supporters after the inevitable victory. They constantly pressured Pompey, who was by nature a cautious and methodical general, to stop delaying and seek one final glorious battle to crush Caesar once and for all. The final showdown took place on the plains of Pharsalus in central Greece in August of 48 BC. The fate of the Roman world would be decided in a few short hours. Pompey, trusting in his massive numerical superiority, had a simple and effective plan. His cavalry outnumbered Caesar's by at least 3-1. He would use this overwhelming advantage to smash Caesar's right flank, sweep behind his lines, and attack his legions from the rear, causing a total collapse. But Caesar, the master tactician, anticipated this exact move. Before the battle began, he did something highly unusual. He secretly handpicked 6 of his best and toughest cohorts, about 3,000 men, from the third line of his main army. He hid them behind his own outnumbered cavalry, creating a secret fourth line, and gave them very specific and brutal instructions. They were not to throw their javelins, the pila, as they normally would. Instead, they were to hold onto them, use them as stabbing spears, and aim directly for the faces and eyes of the oncoming enemy horsemen. The battle began just as Pompey had foreseen. His powerful cavalry charged forward, easily overwhelming and scattering Caesar's weaker horsemen. The Pompeian cavalry, composed largely of young, wealthy aristocrats, began to wheel around the flank, confident of victory. Just as they were about to slam into the rear of Caesar's legions, Caesar gave the signal. His hidden fourth line surged forward. The Pompeian cavalrymen, expecting no resistance and, as Caesar had cynically predicted, valuing their handsome faces more than victory, were horrified by the sight of thousands of legionaries thrusting spears at their eyes. They panicked, broke formation, and fled the field in a disgraceful rout, leaving the infantry on their flank completely exposed. Caesar's reserve now slammed into the side of Pompey's legions, while the rest of Caesar's army, which had been patiently holding its ground, charged from the front. Trapped between the two attacks and utterly demoralized by the shocking flight of their cavalry, Pompey's much larger army disintegrated. The victory was total, a stunning masterpiece of tactics and discipline against overwhelming odds. Pompey the Great, seeing his legions collapse and his cause lost, seemed to shrink into a broken man. He rode back to his tent in a daze, and then fled the battlefield in disguise, a fugitive from the man who was once his son-in-law. The decisive battle of the Civil War was over. After his world-shattering defeat at Pharsalus, Pompey the Great fled for his life. Disguised and broken, he sought refuge in Egypt. He had a history with the Egyptian ruling dynasty, the Ptolemies, having acted as a patron to the young pharaoh's father. He expected sanctuary and a chance to rebuild his forces. He could not have been more wrong. Egypt at this time was in the midst of its own bitter civil war. The throne was jointly held by the 13-year-old pharaoh, Ptolemy XIII, and his ambitious and brilliant older sister, the 21-year-old Cleopatra. The two were locked in a power struggle, and Cleopatra had been forced into exile. The young king was effectively controlled by a cabal of court advisors, who now faced a difficult decision. To grant sanctuary to Pompey would be to invite the wrath of the victorious Caesar. They made a cold and ruthless calculation. To win the favor of the new master of the Roman world, they would offer him a gift. As Pompey's small boat was rowed towards the Egyptian shore, he was met by a Roman officer in the pharaoh's service. It was a trap. As Pompey stood to disembark, he was stabbed in the back and murdered. His head then crudely sawn off. His wife and children could only watch in horror from the deck of their ship just offshore. It was a pathetic and ignominious end for the man who had once been Rome's greatest general. A few days later, Caesar arrived in Alexandria in hot pursuit, with only a small force of about 4,000 men. As a gesture of welcome and alliance, the pharaoh's advisors presented him with their gift, the severed pickled head of Pompey the Great. Caesar's reaction was not one of triumph. The ancient sources are clear that he turned his head away in disgust and wept. It was a complex and very Roman reaction. He wept for the undignified end of a great Roman, his former rival, and his one-time son-in-law. But he was also filled with rage that a foreign client king would dare to murder a Roman consul, depriving Caesar himself of the chance to display his famous clemency one last time. Asserting his authority as Roman consul, Caesar decided to stay in Alexandria. He took up residence in the royal palace and declared that he would act as the arbiter in the Egyptian civil war. His motives were practical. Rome depended on Egypt's vast grain supply, and he needed its immense wealth to pay for his ongoing wars. He needed a stable and preferably friendly ruler on its throne. He summoned both Ptolemy and Cleopatra to the palace to present their cases to him. This presented a problem for the exiled queen. Her brother's forces controlled the harbor and the city. There was no way for her to approach Caesar through official channels. So she resorted to one of the most famous stratagems in history. She secretly made her way to the city by boat and arranged for a servant to smuggle her past the guards. She was famously bound and wrapped inside a thick carpet, or according to other, perhaps more plausible sources, a sturdy linen sack. The bundle was carried into the palace and delivered directly to Caesar's private quarters. There it was unrolled. The 52-year-old conqueror of the world watched as the 21-year-old queen of Egypt emerged, defiant and brilliant. This was no mere plea for help. It was a calculated act of breathtaking audacity. Cleopatra was not only beautiful, she was supremely intelligent, politically shrewd, fluent in multiple languages, and possessed an irresistible charm. She did not beg for Caesar's help. She argued for it, captivating him with her intellect and her courage. Caesar was enthralled. He saw in her a far more capable, intelligent, and reliable ruler than her weak, easily manipulated brother. He made his decision. He would support Cleopatra's claim to the throne. This act immediately plunged him and his small Roman contingent into a desperate war against the much larger Egyptian royal army, who were furious that a foreign general was dictating who should rule them. For months, Caesar, the master of the Roman world, found himself besieged in the royal palace of Alexandria, fighting for his life in the city streets, all for the cause of a young Egyptian queen who had captivated him in a single dramatic meeting. Besieged and outnumbered in a foreign palace, Caesar's situation in Alexandria was perilous. But Roman reinforcements eventually arrived by land, and in the decisive Battle of the Nile, Caesar's tactical genius again proved superior. The Egyptian army was crushed, and the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII drowned in the river as he tried to flee. Caesar had won. He secured the throne of Egypt for the 21-year-old Cleopatra, who was now a loyal and valuable Roman ally. He lingered in Egypt for a time, famously taking the queen on a luxurious 2-month cruise down the Nile, a display of power that solidified her rule and began one of the most famous love affairs in history, which would produce a son they named Caesarion, or Little Caesar. But the master of the Roman world could not rest. While he had been occupied in Egypt, a foreign king named Pharnaces, the son of Rome's old enemy Mithridates, had taken advantage of the civil war to reconquer territory in Asia Minor. Caesar marched his legions north with his customary speed. The resulting campaign was so swift and decisive that it was over almost as soon as it began. At the Battle of Zela, Caesar's veterans annihilated Pharnaces's army. It was this victory that prompted his most famous message back to the Senate, a brilliant piece of propaganda that perfectly captured his military style. Veni, vidi, vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. The civil war, however, was still not over. The surviving leaders of the Optimate faction, including his implacable foe Cato the Younger, had regrouped in the province of Africa, where they had raised a new and massive army. Caesar pursued them there in 46 BC. At the Battle of Thapsus, he again won a brutal and crushing victory. In the aftermath, Cato, seeing that the Republican cause was truly lost, committed suicide in the town of Utica. He chose a martyr's death rather than to live in a world ruled by Caesar and be forced to accept his enemy's pardon, becoming an immortal symbol of lost Republican liberty. One final pocket of resistance remained. Pompey's sons had rallied the last of the opposition in Spain. Caesar met them at the Battle of Munda in 45 BC. It was the hardest, most desperate, and bloodiest battle of his entire life. The fighting was so ferocious that Caesar would later remark that on all other occasions he had fought for victory, but at Munda he had been forced to fight for his very life. After this final, savage victory, the civil wars were finally over. Caesar returned to Rome, not just as a victorious general, but as the undisputed and absolute master of the Roman world. The Senate, now packed with his supporters and the pardoned enemies who owed him their lives, rushed to shower him with honors. They named him Dictator, first for a term of 10 years and then, finally, Dictator Perpetuo, Dictator for life. With unprecedented and absolute power in his hands, Caesar embarked on a whirlwind program of ambitious and energetic reforms, designed to address the deep-rooted problems that had caused the Republic's collapse over the last century. One of his most brilliant and lasting reforms was to the calendar. The old Roman calendar was a chaotic and inaccurate lunar-based system, which priests had often manipulated for political reasons. It had drifted so far out of sync that it no longer aligned with the seasons. With the help of Alexandrian astronomers, Caesar introduced a new solar-based calendar of 365 days, with an extra day added every 4 years. This was the Julian calendar, the very system which, with one minor correction centuries later, the entire Western world has used to this day. He addressed the massive economic debt crisis, not by canceling all debts as radicals demanded, but by implementing pragmatic laws that eased the burden on citizens without destroying the system of credit. To combat the rampant unemployment that plagued the city of Rome, he launched a vast program of public works, ordering the construction of a grand new forum bearing his name, as well as new temples, libraries, and public buildings. These projects not only glorified Rome but, more importantly, provided jobs and wages for the common people. He looked beyond Italy, generously granting Roman citizenship to entire communities in the provinces, especially in Spain and his beloved Gaul. He was beginning to transform the empire from a collection of conquered territories into a single unified state. His energy was boundless. He was rebuilding the world in his own image, bringing order from a century of chaos. As Caesar energetically remade the Roman state, bringing order and stability, the common people generally hailed him as a savior. But the old aristocracy in the Senate watched with growing horror. They saw a man who was not governing but ruling, a man who was dismantling their cherished republic piece by piece, replacing it with a system where his word was law. Their fear and resentment began to fester, eventually crystallizing into a deadly secret plot. The conspiracy grew to include more than 60 senators. They gave themselves a noble name, the Liberators, for they genuinely believed their mission was to free Rome from the grip of a tyrant. 2 men stood out as the leaders, 2 very different personalities united by a single lethal purpose. The true engine and organizer of the plot was Gaius Cassius Longinus. Cassius was a competent military man who had fought in the civil war on Pompey's side. After being pardoned by Caesar, he felt that the dictator had never given him the recognition he deserved. His motives were driven by a proud, bitter nature that resented Caesar's arrogance, despised his absolute power, and viewed the mercy he had been shown not as a gift, but as a condescending insult. The second leader was the man who would give the conspiracy its moral legitimacy, Marcus Junius Brutus. The name Brutus carried an immense symbolic weight in Rome. He was believed to be a direct descendant of Lucius Junius Brutus, the legendary hero who, 500 years earlier, had expelled Rome's last king and founded the Republic. Brutus was a serious, scholarly man, a follower of Stoic philosophy, and widely respected for his integrity. He, too, had fought on Pompey's side. Caesar, who felt a deep, almost paternal affection for him. Some even whispered that Caesar had once had an affair with Brutus's mother, Servilia, had not only pardoned him but had filled his career with honors. Brutus was trapped in a terrible internal conflict. He felt personal gratitude and affection for Caesar, but his devotion to the principles of the Republic and the legacy of his ancestors tormented him. Cassius, who was his brother-in-law, knew that without Brutus, the plot would be seen as a common murder, driven by envy. But with the descendant of the Republic's founder among them, the act could be elevated to tyrannicide, a noble sacrifice to save the state. Public pressure mounted on Brutus. Anonymous messages were left on his magistrate's chair in the Senate, saying, "You are sleeping, Brutus," and "You are no true Brutus," reminding him of his ancestral duty. Finally, after a profound internal struggle, Brutus made his agonizing choice. He concluded that while he loved Caesar, he loved Rome more. The conspirators knew they had to act fast. Caesar was preparing to leave on a massive new military campaign against the Parthian Empire. He planned to be away for 3 years. Once he was at the head of his legions, he would be untouchable. They decided the assassination had to be a public act, not a back-alley ambush. It would take place in the Senate itself on the Ides of March, the 15th day of the month, in 44 BC. The night before, according to the historians, was filled with terrible omens. Strange lights were seen in the sky. Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, had a horrifying nightmare in which she held her husband's murdered body. The next morning, she begged him not to go to the Senate. Caesar, who normally dismissed such things, felt unwell himself and was inclined to agree. But the conspirators had planned for this. One of their own, a man named Decimus Brutus, who was part of Caesar's trusted inner circle, was sent to his house. Decimus gently mocked Caesar, asking if the great conqueror was now going to be ruled by a woman's dreams. He reminded Caesar that the Senate was waiting to vote him new honors, and not attending would be a grave insult. Shamed into it, Caesar changed his mind and decided to go. On his way, a man tried to press a scroll into his hand, a note that reportedly contained a detailed warning, naming every single conspirator. But in the crush of the crowd, Caesar simply passed the scroll to a servant to be read later. It was never opened. As he entered the building, he saw the soothsayer who had warned him to beware the Ides of March. Caesar smiled and said, "The Ides of March have come." The soothsayer replied grimly, "Aye, Caesar, but not yet gone." Inside, as Caesar took his seat, the plotters surrounded him. One, Tilius Cimber, knelt and grabbed Caesar's toga, pulling it from his shoulders. It was the signal. Servilius Casca, positioned behind him, drew his dagger and lunged, but the nervous blow only grazed Caesar's neck. Caesar spun around, furious, and stabbed Casca's arm with his writing stylus. For a moment he fought back, but then the rest of them surged forward, a frenzied mob of daggers. He fought until he saw the face of Marcus Junius Brutus, dagger in hand, ready to strike. At the sight of the man he had loved like a son, all resistance left him. He covered his face with his toga, accepted his fate, and fell lifeless at the foot of the statue of his great enemy, Pompey, bleeding from 23 wounds. In the silent, blood-spattered Senate House, Brutus and the liberators believed they had saved the Republic. They thought that by killing the man, they could kill the idea of one-man rule, and that the free state their ancestors had built would magically spring back to life. It was a tragic and spectacular miscalculation. The Republic they were trying to save was already a corpse, hollowed out by a century of greed, violence, and institutional decay. Caesar had not been the disease. He was merely the most extreme symptom. His murder did not restore liberty. It unleashed chaos. In the power vacuum that followed, two men stepped forward to claim his legacy. The first was Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal, hard-living, and politically shrewd right-hand man. At Caesar's public funeral, Antony displayed the dictator's bloody toga and his wax effigy showing all 23 wounds. He then delivered one of the most masterful funeral orations in history, subtly inciting the crowd to fury. The final stroke of genius was reading from Caesar's will. The people of Rome learned that their murdered leader had left his private, luxurious gardens to be used as a public park for them and had bequeathed a sum of money to every single citizen. The crowd, overcome with grief and rage at the generosity of their slain champion, exploded. They became a lynch mob, grabbing torches from the funeral pyre and storming through the city, hunting for the conspirators. Brutus, Cassius, and the other liberators were forced to flee from Rome in disgrace. The men who had imagined themselves as heroes were now fugitives. But the will contained another, far greater surprise. Caesar had a grandnephew, a sickly and bookish 18-year-old named Gaius Octavius, whom few in the senior circles of Roman politics took seriously. In his will, Caesar posthumously adopted this boy as his son and named him his primary heir. The teenager, now armed with the most powerful name in Roman history, moved with a cunning, patience, and absolute ruthlessness that belied his age. He took the name Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus and immediately began to gather the loyalty of Caesar's veterans. What followed was the final agonizing round of civil wars that the liberators had inadvertently unleashed. Brutus and Cassius raised a large army in the eastern provinces, but they were eventually cornered and defeated at the Battle of Philippi by the combined forces of Antony and the young Octavian. Facing capture, both men chose to take their own lives. The dream of the liberators died with them on a Greek battlefield. The final and greatest irony of all is that the man who would ultimately bring an end to the decades of bloodshed and establish a lasting peace was Caesar's own heir. After one last war, defeating his former ally Mark Antony and his lover, Queen Cleopatra of Egypt, Octavian stood alone as the sole undisputed master of the Roman world. But with a political cleverness that his great-uncle would have admired, he did not proclaim himself king or dictator. He staged a grand public ceremony in which he announced he was restoring the Republic. It was a brilliant fiction. He carefully maintained the outward forms of the old government. The Senate still met, elections were still held, but he concentrated all real military and political power into his own hands. He became Rome's first emperor, taking the new, revered title of Augustus. Thus, the men who had murdered Caesar to prevent a king from ruling Rome had, through their actions, directly created the conditions for Caesar's son to become an emperor, burying the Republic forever. Julius Caesar's legacy is so colossal it is hard to measure. He transformed the Western world. His conquest of Gaul pushed Roman culture and the Latin language to the shores of the Atlantic, laying the foundations upon which modern France, Spain, and even England would be built. His name ceased to be a name and became the ultimate synonym for power, a title that would echo through the centuries in the words Kaiser in Germany and Tsar in Russia. So who was he? Was he a megalomaniac who, driven by limitless ambition, destroyed the liberty of his people? Or was he a clear-eyed visionary who understood that the corrupt, broken republic was no longer capable of governing an empire, and tried to replace it with a more efficient, stable, and just system? The truth is that he was likely both. His story is the tragedy of a man of superhuman talents, whose ambitions ultimately became too great for the system that produced him. He was a general, a reformer, a victim, and in the end, an immortal figure whose shadow stretches across the entirety of Western history.